this has been an absolutely crazy week, and in order to decipher what's been going on with the voice of Parliament, with the Republican debate, with the green lunacy and climate change, along with how to improve our democracy, I've got none other than Professor David Flint, who I'd like to welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Joel, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Look, it's a pleasure to have you back. There's so many people that really requested you come back. They loved having you in a long-form sort of discussion without many interruptions over the course of an hour or two. They're so used to seeing you on Sky News, and you're such a wealth of knowledge. They just found it very refreshing to just get it straight from the man himself. So you've been talking about a number of things this week. I listened to your conversation on 2GB this week, which was really excellent. You've been raising the flag on a number of issues that have been happening. First and foremost, you've been warning Australians about the danger of what's going on with Parliament. A lot of people have a breakdown of trust in Parliament. This week, in fact today, we just heard the news that Josh Frydenberg will actually be taking up a job over at Goldman Sachs, and people aren't very happy about that. And I think that what it's emblematic of is what's going on in the greater society. We're seeing a situation where people are losing trust. This revolving door of politicians having a cushy job on a board or in a large company. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and perhaps percolate that into a greater discussion about the IBAC probe in Victoria and some of the news around the New South Wales Liberal Party.
Well, I would agree that there must be concern about the position the former Treasurer has taken, because this just confirms the closeness between the political class and the other elites. And we see both of them with a similar agenda, and the agenda is a concentration on issues which do not advance the needs of the people of Australia, nor, I think, the needs of the country. And when you look at the principal things which are needed in this country, firstly, we must come to defence, but then there's obviously a need to harvest water. There's a need, particularly in relation to energy, that it be reliable and affordable and available. And also in relation to education, the decline of standards of education. All of these are matters which do not seem to concern the political class. They have issues which I find are not really the significant issues of the day, and some of them, to an extent, are almost imagined. And when you have the elites of the business corporations, not only Australian, but the international business corporations, having a very similar agenda, it doesn't seem appropriate that our representatives or former representatives so easily slot into these positions on international corporations who seem to hold exactly the same views. They're obsessed, for example, with the question of man-made climate change. Obviously, we do have climate change, but we've always had climate change since the time this world was created. The climate just doesn't stand still, and it's ridiculous to suggest it does. But to think that there is one answer for this, and that not only is there one reason for this, there is one solution for this, with a ridiculous proposition that these people who claim to have such a brilliant knowledge are able to tell us what the temperature will be within a percentage of a degree, whereas the weather forecasts daily are never so accurate. And I find this all extraordinary, and I think we are really wasting an enormous amount of resources, and particularly, for example, in relation to energy, where the costs of energy are increasing significantly. And we're being told that if we do what we're told to do obediently, that this will be a significant change, whereas we know, for example, that Beijing, the Chinese communists, produce about a third of the carbon dioxide emissions of the world have no intention whatsoever of reducing these, whatever they say. And we are supposed to completely ignore that. And one wonders what on earth is our political class up to when what they are proposing will result in the economic suicide of this country.
Mm. Do you think that the situation with China and India being some of the larger contributors to climate change, I mean, when are we going to wake up, at least in Australia? In Europe, it seemed as though after during this Ukraine war, that Europe's gotten real about their climate goals. I think Germany, correct me if I'm wrong, has actually fired up their nuclear power stations again, and we're seeing a return back to fossil fuels in order to keep the lights on. I mean, they've been smashed by an absolute heat wave in Europe. Why is it Australia thinks that we know better than what's going on in Europe?
Exactly. Why do our Australian politicians do that? And why are they so extreme? For example, the Germans are firing up their coal-fired power stations again. We can't do that because we've blown up the stations which we closed. They're no longer available. They're making sure that they're no longer available. This is a ridiculous situation. We don't know more than the Europeans. The Europeans have at last woken up to what's going on. This is something which seems to have dominated the political class since the 70s. You might remember, or you're too young to remember, but you might have read, I'm sure you've read, how the Whitlam government, for example, started the policy of heading towards completely free trade, which ideally is workable. But what they have done, or what they did over the years, was unilaterally go to free trade, which meant that when you were in the hard and fast negotiations of entering into a free trade agreement with another country, what could we offer? We could offer nothing because we'd already given up all our defenses, our tariffs and similar controls. We'd given them up unilaterally. Now, only a fool does that sort of thing. It's so untactical, it's so lacking in any sense of strategy to the real world. So when, for example, we entered into the agreements, the free trade agreements, we had to go soft on other things, for example, in relation to foreign investment. And the result is, for example, in relation to communist China, that not only do we have a free trade agreement which the communists don't observe, they're not observing at the present time, they're acting unilaterally in breach of international trade law, and there's not much we can do about it in relation to our coal and all sorts of things like our wine and so on. All of these are being punished because we dared to behave independently. Why are our political rulers so frequently acting not in our interests, but in the interests of what they see as some ideal world, or even perhaps what they see as the interests of another power? And we have a situation today where the overwhelming majority of our politicians seem to be acting not in the interests of this country. And that's a serious situation. And I think it reflects the fact that there are serious disadvantages in the way in which our electoral system is working.
Mm. Yeah, on the topic of what's going on in our region, we've seen a travel blitz done by Penny Wong, who's been doing the trips to a number of Pacific nations, as well as Anthony Albanese to counter the Chinese Communist Party's influence in the Pacific. What's your opinion on this? Because I have to admit, my knee-jerk reaction was, wow, this is actually not that bad. I wish Scott Morrison did something like this. But what's the nuance of this? Am I reading this completely wrong?
Well, I think it's important that we have good relations in the Pacific. It seems to me that the politicians of the Pacific Islands have realized that if they suggest that they are getting into bed with the communists, with Beijing, that will only encourage us to give more money. Now, the countries themselves may receive more aid from us. It may well be that there are personal advantages which some politicians are gaining from that. But there's a great advantage for the powers of the Pacific nations to make spurious complaints, spurious claims rather, about the situation of the weather, where they, in one case, wasn't exactly in the Pacific, but nearby, where the leader of the country broadcast a plea to the world being filmed half in the water or virtually underwater, suggesting that the waters were rising. Yet we know from research which is done that some Pacific islands are growing in size, and none of them seem to be in the serious situation, or any more serious situation than they would have been, but for the fact that they are island nations, some of which are low in the water, and it's not so much climate change, it's claims that they're making which cannot be justified. And we seem to fall for these. We did have the Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, going over there and being embraced by the leader of the Solomon Islands. Probably good copy for the newspapers and media of the two countries and for their political careers, but not meaning much. A lot of this international travel is purely for photo opportunities back home to create a favourable political atmosphere that something is being done. I don't think that the amount of travel that is being undertaken is appropriate. And on a very small aspect of that, it does suggest that since they're telling everybody else about the seriousness of global warming caused by CO2 emissions, it's extraordinary that they go in large jets to these countries, spending an enormous amount, passing away an enormous amount of CO2 emissions, and yet expecting the rest of us to be worrying about something for which there is, according to many leading scientists, no justification.
I want to pivot over to the topic of what's been going on with the Republican debate, with the voice to the Parliament and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Why is this happening now? Why is it that I've heard some commentary from Jacinta Price? She made the point that, Aboriginal people are actually disproportionately overrepresented in the halls of Parliament. I do believe, last I checked, I think there's 11 members of Parliament that are of Aboriginal descent, and that's actually a larger percentage than the Aboriginal population in the Australian population. I mean, why is this coming up now? Can you shed some light on this?
Well, Senator Price, I think, is a great asset, both for the Indigenous people and for the nation, because she speaks the truth. And she tells us about the real problems, particularly in the remote communities. And those problems relate to the women and children who are particularly the subject of extreme violence and of sexual abuse, very serious sexual abuse, beyond any proportion that you would expect in any community. These are serious problems, and they are probably in many ways the result of the creation of the remote communities, mainly by white people. And instead of dealing with this, the solution seems to be on the part of the political class and those Indigenous people who would see some advantage from this for themselves. The solution seems to be virtue signalling. That is, white people demonstrating their virtue by doing something which covers up the real problems. I remember many years ago when I was a young lawyer, there was a former judge who was a dean of law at the University of New South Wales. He later on became a judge. I reversed his position, Hal Wooten, but he started the Aboriginal Legal Service, and it did good things for Aboriginal people who were being seriously underrepresented, and he got young lawyers to volunteer to represent them. So something was being done, but we did that without virtue signalling. We didn't recite, for example, a meaningless formula, sometimes it's completely wrong, about the former or the traditional owners and the past, present, and emerging elders of those tribes. Sometimes they get it completely wrong and refer to a different tribe. That is just virtue signaling. But anywhere you go now, you go to concerts in all sorts of places, speeches, functions, and this formula is recited. And then we get virtue signaling on a big scale, which is this voice to Parliament. This voice to Parliament is only to create additional jobs for a number of people. They're not sure how they're going to do it, the present government. They want to do it in this term. They want to present it as part of the Constitution. They're unwilling to do it first by way of legislation, because legislation can be so easily repealed. And now when they realize that there are questions about this, they're now saying, oh, well, let's just have a general power. We won't go into the details. We won't give them model. There'll be just a power. In other words, what they're asking is for a blank check. They want the Australian people to write a blank check so that this institution can be created by legislation, but it'll always be there under terms of the Constitution.
Yeah, it was quite astonishing. Sorry to cut you in, and that's just Jacinta Price on the left there, guys, starting her first day in the Senate. That was the most intriguing thing, a point you made on 2GB. It was the fact that there are proponents of the voice to Parliament that said, oh, no, we can't let you know about the details about it because that might mean that the referendum doesn't go ahead. We want to give you, as you said, a blank check. I mean, isn't the whole point of a national debate, a national discussion, an amendment to our constitution to, nut over the details? I mean, we had a vigorous discussion about the GST legislation, and not even that was an amendment to the Constitution. That was something that was vigorously debated before the election.
And we had great detail in relation to that. The founders of this country, when they designed the Constitution, decided that the people should be involved. That was encouraged in the original concept of the convention, because after Corowa in 1893 rather, they began the process in 1896, the convention was to be elected, not chosen by the politicians, elected, and in most states it was elected. The whole idea was that the Constitution be approved by the people in a referendum, but also if there were to be any change, they'd follow the Swiss model, unlike other countries. In other countries, they changed the Constitution by a super majority of politicians. Here, they've got to go to the people. And one of the founders explained why it would be more difficult. It wasn't a stop change, he said. He said the whole purpose was to encourage discussion and debate and information so that eventually the proposal would be passed if it were desirable, irresistible, and inevitable. Desirable, irresistible, and inevitable. So if you don't know what is being proposed, you have a ridiculous situation where they're asking for a blank check. And when anybody asks you for a blank check, you immediately would naturally say no to that blank check. And I find it ridiculous that they would even contemplate this.
I do want to. So what was that?
I think I feel this referendum, however they put it, will go down. I can't see the Australian people agreeing to this.
Right. Yes, I'm certainly eager to see exactly how this will pan out. Do you see a situation where the Republican debate will also be smashed down? Because as we said in our previous discussion, you made the point that young Australians, unlike the climate change debate, young Australians aren't indoctrinated to demand a republic. That's not something that they actually seem to be across. They're actually more in support of the monarchy.
Yes.
Where do you see that going?
Well, I think that's so. The last good poll, there was a silly poll that they undertook, very difficult to understand. This was in the Sydney Morning Herald, but not last Australia Day, but the one before, there was an Ipsos poll. It was a proper poll. It just asked the proper questions. But the interesting thing was, when it came to support for Republican change, that is just vague Republican change, not a particular model. The interesting thing was whereas overall support was 34% for a vague idea of a republic. We know that once the model appears, then that is reduced significantly because some people cannot stand one form of republic over another and they prefer the existing system. The very interesting thing, which the Republicans immediately were terrified of, was that when you took the age groups, the age group which was least interested in a vague republic by almost 10% were the young people, the people up to from 18 to 24, 26. And when you get a situation like that, that's a bombshell. And if you can't persuade the young to do something radical and overwhelming, you're never going to get that through.
Sorry?
I think the government realizes, the politicians, they sometimes seem to be a little dense, some of them, but I think they're not stupid. They know that the republic is not the flavour of the day. There was an interesting thing I noticed in the last election, and that was the mainly teal electorates, or ones close to being teal electorates, were electorates which voted strongly yes in 1999. Now, there weren't that many electorates that voted yes in 1999. The no electorates was 72% of the country. That would have been a landslide had it been an election. 72% voted no. That's of electorates, not of people. And among the big ones among the yes ones were the teal electorates, like Wahroonga and Wentworth in Sydney. Very elite suburbs where the Liberal voters tended to be much more elite in their social thinking. And I think the difference between 1999 is in relation to the fashionable issues. The Republic was a fashionable issue among the elites in 1999. Nowadays, it's different. The really fashionable issues are global warming and such things as gender diversity. All those fashionable minority elite issues, which have little concern for the rank and file Australians, are ones which are fashionable. You can only have so many fashionable issues, and the Republic is now, for many people, rather old hat. They've moved on to gender diversity and global warming, except when they drive around in their four-wheel drives and their private aeroplanes and so on. They're very keen about this being imposed on other people who don't have the same wealth as the elites.
Yeah, there was an interesting story that came out today, which I'm sure you saw this. This was that the Minister for the NDIS, former Labor leader Bill Shorten, confirmed that the label birthing parents will be removed from government forms after the mum, Sal Grover, sparked outrage on Twitter. I've got so many thoughts on this, and I'm curious to hear what you've got to say on this. Firstly, how is it that it's the Labor Party that's removing that? How is it that this was on Liberal Party documents? I mean, how woke do you have to be? How woke do you have to be as the Liberal Party, the supposedly Conservative Party, that the Labor Party comes in and removes it? That's the first thing. Secondly, why is it that Twitter has a disproportionate control over what's going on rather than the populace? They know average Australians won't go for this kind of thing. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, this is very much a fashionable issue, gender diversity in an extreme sense. This is the latest Marxist attack. We are susceptible to whatever new Marxist dogma comes in from the United States. And the Marxist dogmas now, and this goes back to the 20s really, from Germany and then the United States because they moved there, and that is the proletariat was Marx's great victim who would ensure the revolution. But the proletariat didn't show much interest in revolution if they were doing well and doing better. And quite often, as Disraeli found in England, the working class can often be more conservative than the aristocracy. And what they needed to do was find new victims, and they constantly find new victims. The latest, of course, are the gender diverse, who would be a tiny number of people, but once they announce that that is the new dogma, then you have to follow that. We also have a situation where political parties have been taken over by the elites. It's easier to do in Australia because there's far less control in Australia than in most Western countries by the members of the political party. In Australia, you'll find that both the Labor Party and especially the Liberal Party are much more under the control of cabals of power brokers who run the parties in their interests and quite often jump on the latest Marxist dogma coming from the United States and meld those together and do well out of the whole situation. And this is a significant failing, I think, in the political system in Australia, where we have parties which have been taken away from their membership, particularly the Liberal Party. So I'm not surprised that this happened in relation to the Medicare documents under the Liberals. Now, the fact that Labor has changed it is a reflection of the fact that Labor would have immediately twigged to the fact of the enormous, overwhelming objection by all mothers to the concept, and men too, fathers, to the reference to birthing parents, suggesting this complete lie that men can bear children. And there are fundamental differences. And they use language to try and get away from those fundamental differences. And one of the words they use is gender. I dislike the use of the word gender. I only use it in relation to grammar. People do not have genders, they have sex. They have a sex with which they're born. There are two sexes and one belongs to either. There are significant differences. They are complementary, of course, but there are significant differences between men and women, and we should not pretend that men can do what women can do and women can do what men can do. It is impossible for a man to give birth to a child, and referring to a birthing parent is a gross insult. But it doesn't surprise me that it happened under the Liberals, in the same way that it doesn't surprise me that in New South Wales, quite often, education is given out in Marxist terms, while there's a coalition minister for education.
Yeah, you made the point that there's significant distrust that's going on, and there is this long march through the institutions that's going on with Labor, with Liberal. The cultural Marxists have basically infected both sides. We had this news this week that Victoria's opposition leader, Matthew Guy, is calling for the resignation of Dan Andrews after the damning IBAC report, IBAC being the anti-corruption sort of body in Victoria. Where do you see things going? Because this isn't just a problem in Victoria. New South Wales, we saw the whole pre-selection fiasco before the election with the Liberal Party civil war, with the power brokers, both in New South Wales and Victoria, having a stranglehold on the process rather than the rank and file membership. Is this going to blow back? Are we going to continue to see a trend like we saw in the election where voters left the major parties, both Labor and Liberal, in droves?
That, I think, will happen, but the problem is the system has been so arranged that it works in favour of the principal parties, and that's the preferential system. And as we know, the Labor Party won around about 30% of the vote in the federal election. They now talk about the mandates that they received from the electorate. Well, Mr. Albanese received no mandates from the electorate. He certainly won a majority in the House of Representatives, but he didn't win a majority vote among the people, and he can hardly talk about mandates. And I think we're going to see this in the States, but I suspect that the media will treat Mr. Andrews much more gently than they would a Liberal, and I think that will help him. The other thing that will help him is the foolishness the Liberal Party in Victoria, which seems to be trying to be more woke than the Labour Party. And we saw this with the extraordinary expulsion of Bernie Finn, because he dared talk about Roe v. Wade, the American case on abortion, and they suddenly decided that they would throw him out of the Liberal Party, at least out of the parliamentary Liberal Party. I think he's now a Democratic Labour Party member of the Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be interesting to have a chat with Bernie Finn next week. I'm actually catching up with him in Victoria. But yeah, this issue of abortion has actually come up this week. You've just reminded me. They're looking to federalise the abortion legislation because, for those that are listening, federal legislation generally trumps state legislation. And there's different regulations in the states, New South Wales, Victoria, and the other states, with regards to abortion. They'd like to homogenise all of that legislation with one federal bill. What are your concerns with that, Professor Flint?
Well, a federal bill on abortion shouldn't be constitutional. It's not a federal power. Depends a lot, of course, on the High Court and whether someone challenges it. Wouldn't matter what would be the point of challenging it, since the laws of abortion in Australia are so liberal. We had that experience in New South Wales when, before the last election, during the campaign, there was no mention of abortion or the need for abortion law reform. Once the parties got into power, this suddenly became a big issue, and the very first bill that came in contained the provision that a baby in a late-term abortions are really terrible things once you start describing what actually happens to what is very clearly a baby. There can be no doubt in that period that this is a baby that we're talking of, and what is done to that baby, to kill that baby, is absolutely appalling. But there was to be a provision in the bill that if a baby escaped a late-term abortion, which does happen apparently, that that baby could then be left to or arranged to pass away peacefully. And that so outraged some of the members of the upper house that they had to withdraw that part. But that was a provision in legislation taken from the United States. Often now the United States is the model for this sort of thing. And when it went through the New York legislature, the New York Senate, there was a standing ovation when this terrible bill went through. And I find it extraordinary in this day and age, when there's so many things available to stop the procreation, so many contraceptives and so on, and where if a baby is born, it doesn't create the social and economic problems which might have been the case in past times, that we are so determined, and the American Democrats are so determined, to kill so many babies. There seems to be an obsession with that, which I find rather macabre. A number of countries do draw a limit at abortion when they say that they believe that the baby can be seen, is seen as possibly viable. But in Australia and America, there seems to be an enormous push on the part of the pro-abortion groups. They cross the parties to really make this a very big thing. And the concept that it was a constitutional right was an invention of some judges in the Supreme Court of the United States to do something which no politician dared do in America, otherwise they would lose the vote. And I see this when it happened as an attempt to change the nation, to make people more accepting of the killing of babies, particularly in the late term, so that society would change. And it's changed society. It's made people much more callous in regard to life, whereas one would have thought that the whole point of the American Constitution is the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life is a very important thing, and Here we have a very low attitude, very low value being placed on life. And of course, in the United States, if I could, I know I'm taking your time.
No, shoot, go for it.
In the United States, the biggest victims, the biggest ones who lose their lives, are those from the black families and the poor families. It's a lot of white elites making a lot of noise so that more black babies can be killed. Is it a racist attitude? Do they want to get rid of more black Americans? And that seems to be the result of what's happening in the United States, and probably will be a similar thing here, that it will be the poorer people who will be wanting the abortions rather than the rich elites who are the ones who demonstrate about it.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing, isn't it? I remember looking at there was this photo that was uploaded. There was this black lady with a sign on her shirt. She had a mask on and she had a sign on her shirt which said abortion for any reason, something along those lines. And then there was another lady next to her, a white lady, and she had her laptop up with all these stickers on it. And it was, I'm part of the pro-life generation, and all these other pro-life slogans. And she also had a Black Lives Matter sticker on there as well. So to your point, why is it that all the abortion clinics, the Planned Parenthood clinics, are in black and lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, but all the, increasing fertility clinics are in the more affluent suburbs? It does come into question the whole idea about, this eugenics debate. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she had some very questionable beliefs on the black community and eugenics. And I mean, guys, it's scary stuff, especially the abortion process. Professor Flint
could do a little study on eugenics because it's the sort of fashionable belief which they claim was scientific, and it's like other scientific views today, which are complete rubbish. For example, this idea that you have birthing parents, that men can give birth to babies, is just absolutely ludicrous.
Insane. I want to finish on the topic of how we can amend Australia as a system, the political system, because there's a lot of issues here where I'm hearing that we're not getting a proper cross-section of Australia. Last time we chatted, we talked about the preferential system, particularly in the lower house, the House of Representatives favouring the major parties. You get Labor, they can govern in their own right with 30-35% of the vote. What can we do to reform the Australian system in order to make it more democratic, particularly for people in the country?
Well, it's over a century, well over a century and a quarter now, since the Constitution was looked at by the people. They've had reviews of the Constitution by groups of lawyers and politicians and so on. We haven't done what we did before the choice of the Constitution, and that is to have an mainly elected convention. I think there's time now. It would be appropriate for the people of Australia to be invited to elect a convention to discuss the Constitution and then come up with changes. And I would like to see a number of changes, and in particular to make the politicians accountable 24/7. And I think this can be done, and the Swiss give us the example. That is the right of the people in Switzerland, the right of the initiative. They can initiate referendums by a petition, a certain number of people. There was a proposal at the time of Federation to do this, but Alfred Deakin talked the South Australian Premier out of it on the basis that responsible government, that is, governments being formed on the lower house, would achieve the same thing. That might have been so in those freer days when the House of Representatives really reflected the people rather than parties. And what I think is we need to change our Constitution, and one of the things that I would be arguing strongly is that we should have the people should be empowered by petition to do all manner of things by referendum, to initiate laws, to take away laws, to reverse rulings on the Constitution, so much so that the people would be in control. And I do think that political parties should not be allowed to get the various enormous amounts of money they get on the first primary vote. They all get $2 something, which leads to millions of dollars. They shouldn't be allowed to get all these financial advantages, all those benefits, plus the special treatment they get under the law of privacy, under electoral law. I believe they get a number of exemptions which are not otherwise available, unless a party is open, transparent, and democratic. You can't have political parties getting all these advantages, getting the names of their parties on the ballot paper, unless they're open, transparent, and democratic. So much so that the people who belong to the party, the ordinary rank and file members, the people who go out and do all the work, should be the ones who make the pre-selections, for example. Not the party bosses, as we saw in New South Wales at the time of the federal election. It should be the rank and file in the party. The Americans they go one step better, and that's the primaries. Now, the primaries are wonderful because it takes any control out of the political party, because you register as a supporter of a political party. So you're a registered Republican. You can decide who the candidate will be, because all the registered Republicans do that. That's how Trump got in. He wouldn't have got in had it been left to the Republican establishment. He was the last one they wanted. And I think that the rank and file supporter of a typical Labour voter or Liberal voter, National voter, they should be the ones who choose the candidates, not the party bosses. And when you have the cabals of power brokers deciding who's to get the pre-selection, they do so not on merit. They don't choose the best person. Well, that rubbish about having quotas for women is stupid, I think. What they need is to let the rank and file choose the best candidates. The best people to choose that are the party members, or even better, the supporters, because they will go for merit more often than not. So you'll get the best candidates in Parliament. Now we're just getting people who are apprentices. They're apprentices to politicians. They work as so-called advisors to politicians. They're waiting in their offices. The only thing they learn, you can't learn how to govern. The only thing they learn is how to manipulate, using their mobile phones to engage in political manipulation, trying to work out to get a safe seat. They get a safe seat through their allegiance to a particular power broker who's getting all the contracts. And they do that in a roundabout way so it doesn't breach ICAC rules. And they're the ones who are running the political parties. It's not legal corruption, but it's moral corruption.
I have to make a point here, Professor Flint. I hate to do this, Professor Flint, and it's not your fault. It's big tech's fault. It's the fact checks that are written about us. Just to clarify, guys, Professor Flint made the point that political parties are paid $2 something for every vote. That is absolutely true. More specifically, Professor Flint, I'm doing this exercise because we actually got fact checked on this, and we ended up getting decreased actual interactions with people because they shadow banned our accounts. So I have to do this as to make sure that they understand. I understand what you mean. My audience understands what you mean. But there's some very pedantic people at organisations like the Australian Associated Press and other Facebook fact checkers that really don't appreciate this. And this goes to the greater debate on big tech. So with payments for this particular system, guys, as Professor Flint correctly said, each political party at a federal level, they get paid, as of the last election, $2.90 for every vote they get if they achieve over 4% of the vote in that particular seat. or at a Senate level for the upper house. On a state level, I do believe it's more than that. It's nearly $5 for with the same percentages there. It has to be at least over 4%, and you get that much for every vote. I just wanted to clarify that, just so you guys know. And Professor Flint, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that I have to do that, that I have to completely ruin the flow of a discussion because there are people that they don't understand when we just say things, that they will listen to everything you say. There will be nothing wrong with what Emeritus Professor David Flint has said, but that one just sort of throwaway line, they will get that and they will derank the whole channel. It's insane.
Well, I agree with you entirely on your factual description, and mine was a shorthand way of trying to do that, and I think yours is like a footnote in an article where you're given all the same. I agree. That's precisely what I was trying to refer to. It goes to the party, and it's a lot of money. And I think in return, what I'm proposing is that in return for that, and in return for the exemptions, they should be required by law, or even constitutionally, to be open, transparent, and democratic. And that would mean that the members would be choosing the parties, choosing the party pre-selections.
I did want to touch on something that you I think you've said in the past, adding more states. In America, they have 50 states. Their upper house and Congress is the Senate, and they have 2 members of the Senate that from each of the 50 states to help keep things equal, and all the states, especially the rural states, often the red states, in the actual debate. Do you think we should add more states to Australia to better balance things?
I think so, and my reason is that if you don't, and with the natural flow of people to the capitals, you get a situation where the state is run from the capital, and the majority of politicians are elected from the capital, sort of really top heavy, so that New South Wales is run in the interests of Sydney, Victoria is run in the interests of Melbourne, and Queensland is run, big state, run in the interests of southeast Queensland. That is that conglomeration which is around Brisbane down to the border. And that is unhealthy. It only creates further concentrations, whereas there are legitimate interests, and Queensland is the classical case. Queensland, even at the time of federation, had big moves for new states in the north and the centre, and I think there's a good case for that. But I would say the same in Sydney. If we don't want overdevelopment in the capitals, we really have to break down the powers and have newer states. I think we have, notwithstanding the argument during the COVID matter, that the states were very strong. The states were only very strong during COVID because the Prime Minister let them be strong in an area where he had a lot of authority. The quarantine power is a power which is federal and state, but the federal authorities can dominate there. The federal government had sufficient powers to control a lot of what was happening. They didn't do much to try and open the borders between the states, which served no good advantage and created a lot of distress and unhappiness. I think that the states are, in effect, in the areas where they should be stronger, they are weak. We are the most centralized federation in the world. I can't think of another federation in which the central government collects probably over about 80% of the taxes, gives back about half to the states, but tells the states how to spend the money. So you get the Commonwealth putting its nose into education, and the more the Commonwealth puts its nose into education, the lower the standards go. And the Commonwealth should be concentrating on its areas, which the Constitution gave to them. Defence, for example. Given that we are, without the United States and to an extent Britain, we are, because of the Commonwealth, near defenceless because of what they've done with the defence acquisitions budget. They're not concentrating on the most important power, which they should be. And they're going into other areas which have nothing to do with them. For example, education, which is a state matter. I think one of the worst things that we sometimes do is there seems to be an obsession. If there's a problem in this country, throw a lot of government money at it and centralize it. If it's not centralized, at least make it identical, so that everything in the country is identical. The way to find out whether governments are making a significant error or whether one government is doing something which is better than the others is to have differences. The best example that I can remember was under the much maligned Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who was the Premier of Queensland. Every state and the Commonwealth had what were called death duties. They were extraordinarily punitive on people at the weakest moments in their lives, people particularly in the middle classes, who found that when one of the, usually the man died first, or perhaps the woman, that person would die, they'd have a business or something like that, the death duties, which come in a lump sum, would be massive, taking up a vast proportion of the estate, forcing sales which weren't in the interests of running a business or running a property. It was Joh Bjelke-Petersen who alone, against the advice of the bureaucrats, the advice of his own treasurer, abolished death duties. What happened? All the elderly, not all the elderly, but a vast number of older people, for some reason, didn't want to leave their properties and their estates to the government. For some reason or other, they thought that their children should receive that, or their families should receive that. And a large number of people began to move to Queensland, and it forced the other states to eventually, and the Commonwealth, to abolish their forms of death duties. The Commonwealth had their own, they called it a state duty.
Yeah.
They were all cashing in at the moment of great sadness and confusion, and often when it destroyed them. And it was it was the worst tax you could possibly have. And it got rid of because we had differences between the states, and we had a premier who decided that he was going to get rid of it.
There's such a great lesson in that. It's that if you can just get one quality premier, just like Ron DeSantis or even Greg Abbott in Texas, then you can really set the standard. And we've seen a massive Exodus-style movement of people from New York to Florida and from California to Texas because of those reasons. Governor Ron DeSantis, a lot of people want him to run for the presidency. A lot of others who like him as well suggest that that's not a good idea because he is setting an agenda for all 50 states. He's setting the standard. He saved Florida. That's what a lot of people, even a lot of liberals over there, more left-wingers like even the great Joe Rogan, have actually made the point that, you know what, you got to hand it to the guy. He saved Florida's economy. And, you know, look at what's happening with the property market there. It's so not inflated. People are moving there in droves from some of the most wealthy suburbs in the state of New York. In fact, one of the great things, this is a point that Ben Shapiro makes, one of the great things the rich people are good at is getting up and moving when it's unfavorable because of high taxes, because of you just can't start a business, because of what you alluded to there in Queensland. If we had one good premier or governor in the USA, you could really set the standard and move forward. And New South Wales is our state. I'm really hoping that New South Wales can be a state where we do set the agenda, and we do have an excellent premier that gets in, so that they can set the standard for the other states. Otherwise, people will vote with their feet, as you said before in that example. Thank you for that. That's such a wealth of knowledge. I didn't know that happened. That's an excellent example. For a bit of background for people, when you add an additional state, not only do you have typically either a bicameral or a unicameral parliament for the state level, but you are actually given 12 federal senators as well. And those 12 senators can advocate for you on a federal level. And it's staggered as well, so that if there's a rapid change in the community, that change tends to be a lot more staggered, which was part of the brilliance of the founding fathers of Australia when they incorporated that into the system. But I would, yep.
The number of senators are there for the original states. The new states that would be determined when they enter. And whether, for example, if New South Wales, let's say Queensland were broken up, as you've got on the map, that wonderful map there, that lower part of Queensland, would that still be Queensland and the rest new states when they're determining how many senators should be given? But you're quite right, there will be senators, certainly, for the new states. And there'd be a capital, and which tends to attract a concentration of business. And sometimes people worry about a return to the upper house in Queensland. The house was abolished. There was a referendum in Queensland in about 1915, round about then. And the people overwhelmingly voted to keep the Legislative Council. The politicians then waited for a couple of years and then abolished the Legislative Council, which they could do under the Constitution. There's no need to have more politicians by having an upper house. You just reduce the size of the lower house. There's no reason why you've got to have a certain size of electorates. You can, but the advantage of having an upper house elected in a different way is that there's more chance of trial and error and checks and balances if you have a different group up in the Legislative Council taking a different view, as we find in New South Wales, with proportional representation in the upper house and electorates in the lower house. You get different groups. So you get someone like Mark Latham and Fred Nile in the upper house who wouldn't get into the lower house, but they do present a different view and have a very effective effect there.
Yeah, it's astonishing, that's a systemic problem I see with our voting system in Australia. It does favour the incumbents. How is it that in the state of Queensland, by my definition, there are 4 freedom senators? You've got Pauline Hanson, Malcolm Roberts from One Nation. You've got who have you got? You've got the National Senator, Matt Canavan, and you've also got Senator Gerard Rennick. How is it that you have 4 senators out of 12, yet you can't really get that sort of quality of candidate in the lower house on a state level? I mean, it just makes no sense. The voters are there; it's the same voters, but we haven't yet seen a One Nation person get up. Correct me if I'm wrong, in the lower house there.
Not in the federal parliament. I think they were in the state parliament.
Right, I didn't know that.
But the point is, and I agree with you entirely. The point is, the lower house is so stitched up in terms of preferential voting and compulsory voting that it does tend to keep the old guard in. Whatever voting system you have will help one party, but it changes from time to time. For example, preferential voting worked in favour. It was brought in by a coalition, by a Conservative person, but when they changed the Senate to proportional and preferential, it was to help the Labor Party, obviously. But then, of course, the Labor Party split. Nobody anticipated a split of the Labor Party split. And the split in the Labor Party helped Menzies. It meant a longer period of Liberal government. The Liberal government wouldn't have been in for such an unbroken period, I don't think, but for the fact that the Labour Party split and you had a DLP, a Democratic Labour Party, who were handing their preferences to the Liberals. So the preferential system no longer helped the Labour Party.
Yeah. This is very fascinating. Sorry if you guys are falling asleep at home, but this is actually really, really interesting to me, because it's like we could actually reform this country. I mean, it's actually, we have the mechanisms to actually do this. And it's call me young and maybe naive, but I do feel that it's within our grasp if we set our mind to it with good messaging, with the coordination of protests and freedom parties getting off their butt and actually setting the agenda and campaigning properly. I really think we could do this. And there are some brilliant ideas here, Professor Flint, and I want to thank you for sharing them with us today. It's been an absolutely insane week, and to make matters worse, we are seeing a situation where we might be returning back to mania. For those of you that can't see this, it says Albo. Why do they call me each way Albo? And then it's also Albo, and there's a photo with him and all these nurses wearing masks as a selfie, and then him with the similar sort of photo with nurses with them all not wearing masks. Professor Flint, we're going into another wave of sickness through the winter. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? And we'll wrap up the show.
Well, I think we should do what we should have done in the past. We shouldn't adopt the solution which was the model proposed by the communists, the Chinese Communist Party, the idea of lockdown. And we had a plan. It was written by Tony Abbott when he was Minister for Health. It received international accolades. It was put away in some filing cabinet and probably never looked at it again. But the obvious thing is, in relation to this sort of thing that comes in, epidemic from overseas, if they are obviously vulnerable, you look after them. And this illness, unlike the one which was around when I was a boy, that was polio, this illness attacks the elderly and the already sick. And they're the ones who should be protected. And as for the rest, they should be given sensible advice and hopefully get them to observe that advice in relation, for example, to what you do when you cough and sneeze, that you don't do what has become almost commonplace over recent years, where people cough and sneeze openly in trains and lifts and so on, and do it over everybody, behave themselves properly. Washing their hands. Washing hands is obviously an important thing. I remember in another country where I was in a bathroom and I saw a person with a cook's hat come in, go to one of the cubicles, come out, walk straight past the taps and go out. And I thought, well, I'm not going to eat in this place. They're basic rules of hygiene, which we have learned over time, and obviously they should be observed. But government's role is really to look after the vulnerable, do all they can to look after the vulnerable. The idea of locking down everybody and imposing things which are questionable are not the solutions. And there should be, I think, an enormous amount of freedom in relation to these things. There may be a time when you have to have some compulsion, particularly in highly contagious, very dangerous diseases. But I think when you have something like this, you should do that. And also, statistics should be much more honest. In relation to this, we should know the difference between those who pass away as a result of this and those who pass away with it. And there's a vast difference in that, and it is so wrong to do this. And one of the things which we must attend to very soon is the enormous power in governments in making regulations, laws, without going through proper processes. And we've had that without the checks and balances which applied in this country, even in colonial times. And we've had the most drastic example I remember in New South Wales was when the Minister for Health, on the advice, I think, or in discussions with the Premier, closed down the construction industry for a few weeks. And the medical advisor, the chief medical advisor, said, "Well, I didn't advise that." So where was the advice? Why didn't that go, as it should have gone, I think, to the Executive Council, chaired by the Governor? Why didn't it go with something like an explanatory memorandum with all the documents so that we could all know what was happening? And why then wasn't it presented to both houses of Parliament, with either house having the power to disallow, which was normal during colonial times? Why have we receded into more of a dictatorship these days?
I do believe Parliament was suspended at the time, so there wasn't even able to be made criticism. And I was a big proponent of the 20,000 person e-petition, which ended up asking to recall Parliament. It was a ridiculous idea that you couldn't have even the representatives elected by the people to even criticise the government. A government where the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, was under the thumb of ICAC, and many people believe that if she were to return to Parliament, then ICAC would be removing her from office. But yeah, it just seems a while ago that all of that happened. I don't understand how, premiers have resigned for less previously, and here we are with premiers that are absolutely shameless, and they've never said sorry. I mean, they'll continue saying sorry to the Aboriginals until kingdom come, even though there's no one alive today that did to the Aboriginals what happened 100 years ago. But the fact of what's been happening with the pandemic being so fresh, 2 years, and ongoing, I mean, it's ridiculous. In fact, there was a story that I mentioned this week. See, Professor Flint, I enjoy having conversations with you too much. We're over an hour. There was this story that came out, you might not be able to read that, where it basically a lady in the education employee was actually arrested for using her fake job certificate in order to actually keep her employment. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing, because what is this going to do? I was talking to a legal expert last night, and he made the point that there is obviously more to this particular case. I don't know if you heard about this, but regardless, this lady has been criminally charged, and if it's proceeded and it goes through and the courts uphold it, then I could think of many people who are going to struggle if they start going on a witch hunt for this sort of thing.
I'm sure you're right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor David Flint, I want to thank you for tuning in again. Please give this a share if you liked it. If you want to find more from Professor David Flint, don't worry, I will be getting him back very soon when we need his guidance on some of the topics going on. And if you want to follow some of his articles that he's writing every week, he writes fairly regularly for The Spectator and every now and then for the Epoch Times. I've been enjoying reading his latest pieces where he goes into a lot more detail than these discussions. And Professor Flint, thank you so much. You're a wealth of knowledge, and we're all blessed to have you here to share that knowledge with us.
Thank you very much, Joel. It was enjoyable.
Thank you so much.